came in with pretty broad support and excitement. And the general mood in New York has remained quite high.
How has New York's groundbreaking new leader fared in his first 100 days in the mayor's office? This is The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the cities we live in. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. This week we unpack some of the campaign promises that led New Yorkers to choose Zohran Mamdani as their new mayor, and how those big ambitions have panned out so far. From housing and affordability to small businesses and transit, our correspondents and guests will mark Mayor Mamdani's report card and look ahead to his first full term. Plus, we get an impression of how immigrant communities in the city have reacted to the recent change in City Hall too. That's all ahead right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. 100 days is a fairly short time frame to do something like paint your spare bedroom, let alone paint a city in your image, especially one as nuanced and unwieldy as New York. This time frame is nonetheless important to residents and reporters alike in order to measure how well an elected official is faring in their new role. New York's newest mayor, Zohran Mamdani, took office on the 1st of January. A democratic socialist who was elected on a platform of free transport, rent freezes and support for universal childcare and small businesses. Born in Uganda to parents of Indian descent, he is also a groundbreaking mayor when it comes to demographics, being New York City's first Muslim and first Asian American mayor. On today's programme, we'll look at some of the campaign promises Mayor Mamdani made and how they are progressing just over 3 months into his tenure. And if there was an overarching theme of his candidacy, affordability was it, with housing and rental prices at the heart of that rallying cry. So how has the housing situation in New York changed? Monocle's Henry Rees Sheridan sent us this report.
For decades, Republicans and Democrats have pandered to American homeowners for a simple reason. People who own their own homes tend to vote at higher rates than those who don't. But when Zohran Mamdani kicked off his campaign to become mayor of New York City, he flipped the script on its head, banking on a direct and loud appeal to the 69% of New Yorkers who rent their homes as opposed to owning them. The two main promises he made were to reduce the cost of housing by building 200,000 new affordable homes over 10 years, and to freeze rent on apartments controlled by the city. These policies won the support of many voters and played a major part in getting Mamdani into office. The cost of housing is by far the single biggest expense most New Yorkers face. More than half of the city's renters spend over 30% of their income on rent, and a third spend over 50% of their income on housing. Mamdani's alignment with renters is both natural and credible. He himself is the leaseholder on a rent-stabilised one-bedroom apartment in the Astoria neighbourhood of Queens, and is the first renter to be elected mayor of New York City since Ed Koch, who won the office in 1977. In his first 100 days in office, Mamdani has already taken steps towards his most ambitious housing goal of creating 200,000 new affordable homes. The most significant so far came in late March, with the announcement of the Neighbourhood Builders Fast Track policy, which makes it easier for affordable homes to be built on land owned by the city.
And we're all here together today for an announcement where we launch the Neighbourhood Builders Fast Track. What does that mean? Because I know it doesn't explain itself. What this means is that we are creating a pre-qualified roster of developers. And in doing so, we are going to cut down on pre-development time for new projects from 18 months to 10 months.
Mamdani's determination to build and his willingness to slash red tape to do so has led him to court unlikely allies. In late February, Mamdani made a surprise trip to Washington to meet President Trump. He brought with him a mock-up of a front page of the New York Daily News, the city's largest tabloid, with the headline, "Trump to City, Let's Build," printed in bold capitals above a portrait of the president. Shortly after the meeting, Mamdani posted a picture of him standing alongside a beaming Trump, who was holding the prop behind the presidential desk in the Oval Office. In a deadpan caption, Mamdani wrote that he was looking forward to building more housing in New York City. Despite his strategic ideological flexibility, Mamdani's ambition to build 200,000 units of housing still faces massive challenges. The most fundamental is money. To realise the plan, the city will need to borrow an additional $70 billion over the next decade, on top of the roughly $25 billion already committed to affordable housing in the city's existing capital plan. This would push the city well past its legal debt ceiling and require the approval of New York's governor and state legislature in Albany, where at least some lawmakers are likely to balk, given the additional debt service it would impose on an already strained budget. At the federal level, the picture is no easier. The Trump administration's proposed budget cuts rental assistance by 40%, and the administration has withheld $18 billion in federal transit funding for the city. A reminder of just how precarious the relationship between Trump and his home city remains, notwithstanding the Oval Office photo opportunity. In the shorter term, Mamdani has committed to a freeze on rents. In practice, this means that rents will not go up on the roughly 1 million apartments in the city that are rent stabilised, that is, whose price is set annually by the Rent Guidelines Board, a 9-member body appointed by the mayor. About 1 million of New York City's 3.5 million housing units are rent stabilised, providing homes to some 2.5 million people, nearly 30% of the city's population. Under Mamdani's predecessor, Mayor Eric Adams, the board approved 4 consecutive annual rent increases, totaling 12% over his time in office. A freeze will obviously come as a relief to the city's renters, but the landlords who own rent-stabilised apartments worry that the measure could push them into insolvency. Since 2020, expenses for owners of rent-stabilised apartments have risen by 22%, while rents haven't kept up, growing by roughly 11%. 10% of rent-regulated buildings already report operating costs equal to or higher than their rental income, meaning they are close to the edge of tax foreclosure. Landlord groups also point to the tens of thousands of apartments they say are standing empty across the city, so-called ghost apartments that owners say aren't worth investing capital in because the rents are too low to cover renovation costs. Tenant advocates dispute the scale of the problem, and the true number of such apartments is genuinely contested. But it speaks to a real tension at the heart of Mamdani's housing agenda. Policies designed to protect the renters who are already housed may make it harder to get new apartments onto the market. The Rent Guidelines Board is scheduled to take a preliminary vote in May, with a final decision in June. Any changes would apply to leases taking effect between October 2026 and September 2027. The decision is likely to set the template for the city's approach to rent-controlled apartments for as long as Mamdani is in office, and the consequences will resonate beyond New York. The conditions that renters face here, wages that haven't kept pace with housing costs, home ownership that feels permanently out of reach, and a political class that has historically been more attentive to those who own than to those who rent, are felt in cities across America. Mamdani's bet is that those conditions also represent a political opportunity, and that New York City is the place to prove it.
My thanks there to Henry Rees Sheridan for his report. Next up, we turn to the small businesses of New York. Mayor Mamdani was regularly seen visiting the bodegas of his city during his campaign for that now famous sandwich order.
Habibi, could I get an egg and cheese on a roll with jalapeno?
One Zohran special coming up.
Supporting small businesses like the ones that served his favourite breakfast sandwich was another of his pillars that he pitched to citizens. But how has life changed for the everyday store owner? Monocle's Anita Riotta, a former New York resident and business reporter, joins me now to discuss this. An ex-resident New Yorker, you know much about the city, and when people hear you speaking, they'll believe that as well, I believe. Let's just start with, what were the promises made to the electorates about supporting small businesses in New York by the mayor?
Well, as listeners will remember, Mamdani, when he was running for mayor, his whole message, his whole campaign was about affordability. And while maybe headlines were grabbed more so by childcare improvements and free buses, small business affordability and making sure that people that wanted to create a business were supported by the city were also really foundational to his message to New Yorkers. But what he really focused in on was that he wanted to cut fines for small businesses if they had infracted regulation by half, speed up permitting, and make sure that there were more online resources available. A lot of times it's you have to go file this document in person or spend hours on the phone, which is obviously restrictive to people trying to set up their own business. He said he will invest in these types of resources 500% more, and that he will appoint a mom and pop czar to ensure that all of these other policies that he has implemented will actually be used by the population. And actually, I think one of the first ways I interacted with Mamdani when he was on the campaign trail was he had a really viral video of talking to halal cart owners and saying to them, how much was it to apply for your permit? And it's staggering numbers. And so this really blew up and became a main policy point for him almost immediately.
Well, we can't ignore the title, Mom and Pop Tsar. It's such a great title. What is the role of the Tsar?
So essentially, the Mom and Pop Czar is meant to cut red tape for small business owners. There's something like 6,000 rules and regulations for small businesses in New York City. Imagine you are trying to start a business, secure funding, interact with your community, and then you have to be abreast of 6,000 regulations. So trying to streamline those, trying to make sure that there are special permits for small businesses that are different than those that apply to their larger peers. And also something that he has said is that he wants to be a fix, not fine administration. So that if you are trying to streamline these regulations, if a business makes a mistake or doesn't submit the right permit or, has infracted a rule, try to work with them to fix and get them to comply rather than immediately charge these quite high fines oftentimes.
And you need to unpack for us the culture of the bodega, because even when you go to Manhattan, even wealthy parts of Manhattan, there's often a corner store that's run by a family. There's a whole culture that we don't see maybe in even in central London.
Absolutely. I would say the bodega is a cultural pillar of New York, and really a cultural pillar that we should fight to keep, because you do see in New York, like a lot of other cities, the disappearance of these stores that give the city so much of its personality, and then it becomes, a chain bakery or some cold, personality-less place. But the bodega is, you'll get anything from your ibuprofen to a hot sandwich. There's always a cat somehow. There's always a bodega cat. I don't know if it's the owner's cat, if the cat runs the bodega, if it comes, with the structure. And it really is, when I was a teenager, you have your bodega, the person running it. It just builds an actual neighborhood feel in a city that's so big. You need these touch points. You need your bodega, your deli, your place. If not, you just get lost in a sea of sameness. So I think that actually creating places that feel unique to each neighborhood, that allow for personality to be brought back into the city, is really foundational.
And so the Mom and Pop Czar will be looking after these people as well, I take it. And we have an appointee as well, Delia Owusi. Do we know much about her?
So Delia Owusi was just recently nominated. She was most recently the director of the Business Outreach Center Network in Brooklyn. She focused a lot on women-led businesses and making sure that they were getting the same opportunities as anyone else trying to start a business. The Mamdani administration has also said that they want to focus on making sure that immigrants and women and people of color who have struggled more often in the past to have, the opportunity to launch a business. These new plans are also geared towards them. But something that Delia Owusi will be tasked with immediately, all agencies that are under her or that work in this business arena have 90 days, where possible, to eliminate as many initial business fees as they can find. So in 90 days from her appointment, or when she takes office, rather, they will have 90 days to make sure that they are sifting through all the fees that a small business has to go through and are actually just immediately trying to eliminate something. And I think that that's quite a good faith way to start her new role.
And just finally tell us, the New York Future Fund, which is another promise. What's this about?
The New York Future Fund is a loan program, and it's designed to expand access to affordable financing for everyone, but especially the community's immigrant, minority, and women-owned businesses. The administration is trying to lower borrowing costs pretty significantly. The minimum loan amount used to be $100,000, and now it's $25,000. They've reduced interest rates. They're trying to make repayment terms more flexible, and they've expanded which these small businesses are that are eligible to benefit from all of these things. So they are ambitious, but there do seem to be accountability elements in place immediately to try to make sure that these things actually take off.
And just tell us finally, when you used to go to your bodega, what was in your bodega bag?
My bodega order, I have to admit, is most often a hungover bodega order. So I think the perfect hungover bodega order is a bacon, egg, and cheese on a sesame bagel toasted, ketchup, hot sauce on the side, and a Snapple peach. And also, if you can, bonus points if you can go back in time and get the Snapple glass bottle that gave you that excellent pop when you opened it. The plastic one, not as good.
How good is it? I remember when Snapple first came to the UK and that sound, we inherited that sound.
Come on, you need it. The fact.
Anita, thank you so much for coming on The Urbanist. Next up, transit. While New York is famous or perhaps infamous for its subway system, Mayor Mamdani focused on buses during his campaign, vowed to make riding the bus free for all. But how has he put those plans into action? And are those changes even likely to come to pass at all? To review the transport situation in the city, Monocle's Mary Holland sent us this report.
Among the signature promises Zohran Mamdani made during his campaign, free bus services might have been one of the boldest. It's important to remember that in the US, the welfare state barely exists, and anything free seems unimaginable. It's not that the idea didn't resonate with New Yorkers. In a city that's facing a major affordability crisis, where transportation is the second largest cost after housing, making up 14% of household spending, a free bus ride could save people hundreds of dollars a year. And while there have been some cities in the US, such as Kansas City and Boston, that have some routes that have gone fare-free, there are significantly smaller urban areas than New York, and fare revenues make up a smaller percentage of the budget. There was also a temporary model closer to home. In 2024, a pilot backed by Mamdani saw the MTA offer free service on 5 bus lines across the city, one in each borough. It served nearly 50,000 weekday riders, with ridership rising 30% on weekdays and 38% on weekends. Assaults on bus operators dropped by almost 40%. While Mamdani called it a success, the MTA argued the ridership gains were down to existing riders taking the bus more often, not new riders coming on board. For Mamdani, the route to getting to free buses is anything but direct. Of course, implementing this idea has its challenges, namely getting Governor Kathy Hochul on board. The MTA, which runs the vast majority of buses in the city, is a state agency and therefore not under the mayor's control. Another challenge is cost. Bus fares generate around $600 million a year, money the MTA relies on to pay drivers and maintenance costs. Several months in, free buses are still more of a promise than a policy, with no clear funding strategy in sight. But Brian Fritsch, Associate Director of the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA, tells us that there has been some movement on making things speedier.
There has been very little on the free bus side. Most of the effort and momentum that we've seen has come around making buses faster, which actually is the piece that the city has much more control over. The MTA is a state agency and so much more directly responsive to the governor than the mayor. And I think the governor has some reservations about free buses and losing the revenue that, the MTA relies on. But the one thing that the city has a huge role in is how buses move across the streetscape. So we've seen a lot of activity from the new Department of Transportation Commissioner Flynn and his team on speeding up buses and, using the many tools in their toolbox that really the Adams administration had completely ignored for 4 years.
There are also existing programs Mamdani could build on that, while not free, would make buses far more affordable. Fair Fares is a discount program where riders pay 50% of the standard fare. It has its drawbacks. Currently, only 35% of the population is eligible for it, and the application process is onerous. But Danny Pearlstein, the Policy and Communication Director at Riders Alliance, explains that reducing fares could be a useful tool during the interim, something that could benefit the subway too.
So the city already has the largest low-income transit fare discount program in North America. It's called Fair Fares. Even it is undersubscribed, right? It could be reaching a lot more people, and it could be doing a lot more work. And so what we're trying to do there is expand Fair Fares for a relatively smaller cost than free buses, but to reach more low-income people, so you don't have to have quite as low an income to qualify for the half fare. And what we're hoping is that for the existing eligible population, the very low-income people, they would actually get a free fare on the bus and also on the subway. Because right now, there's sort of a lightning rod or third rail issue around subway fare evasion, not so much around bus fare evasion, which is actually higher, but around turnstile jumping, right, which is very visible, and for a lot of people, a signal of disorder and something that people have thought and talked a lot about for a very long time. And so as a result, the MTA is spending over $1 billion on new turnstiles. The city and the MTA together spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year enforcing the subway fare. And so we're hoping that the city and the MTA could recoup some of that and instead invest it in free and reduced fares for more low-income New Yorkers. Because enforcement itself is a big expense. We're spending a lot of money to squeeze very poor people for a little bit of money. That's a bad policy. Instead, let's invest it in fare reductions.
Now, with free buses, ridership would almost certainly rise, bringing with it demand for more buses, more depot space, more drivers and infrastructure. And there's an outstanding question. Who will pay for all of this? While Mamdani has yet to roll out any kind of payment plan, it might not only come down to taxpayers.
It's a very small percentage of some very large budgets, right? So, it's less than 1% of the city budget, less than 0.5% of the state budget. And that money is desired for many other things, right? We're not blind to that. But at the same time, there are other potential sources of revenue to tap. Obviously, the mayor is very focused on taxing the rich. I think there's also some consideration being given in the city now to charging more for public parking, because it's a big giveaway. For example, I park a car on the street for free. If I parked it in the garage next to the street, it'll cost me $500 a month. And so while that's too steep, I could imagine paying $150 or $200 a month to park on the street. And that's something that could support free buses for all New Yorkers.
There may also be an upside beyond the balance sheet. Freeing up money people currently spend on fares could, according to Pearlstein, have a surprising ripple effect.
I think usage will go up. There's a few different things that we think will happen. One is it will put money back in the pockets of the people who need it most, and they will spend that money in their communities. So it will have an economic multiplier effect in low-income communities across the city. It will also put the bus network on a sounder fiscal footing, because right now, if half of people aren't paying their fares, there's a deficit involved, and it's harder to provide the bus service that New Yorkers deserve. And the third thing is it will transform how the bus is viewed in the city. Right now, the bus has been an afterthought. One of the very exciting things about Mamdani's campaign and mayoralty is putting the bus front and center in people's minds and remembering that New Yorkers actually depend heavily on the bus. We have the largest bus ridership in North America, even if we have an iconic subway that gets all the attention. And so by making the bus free, we'll actually bring more people on board who might not have got on board just because they didn't know what the fare was or didn't want to think about how to figure it out. But we'll also recruit some more political support for making the bus fast, which, has long been our goal, right? We have the slowest buses in North America. And yet when the free bus pilot was first enacted in Albany after Mamdani campaigned for it, he got support for the pilot from members of the legislature who had expressed no interest in bus policy before, but they saw the wisdom in lowering costs. And so we're hoping that by tying that all together, we'll end up with a faster bus as well and more political will to do the things on our streets that are sometimes controversial to speed up bus service and save bus riders time.
Spotlighting the bus is likely what the city needs. While most people think of New York as a subway city, more New Yorkers ride the bus than the train. They're mostly low-income or essential workers who work in sectors such as healthcare and education, who rely heavily on a system that's underfunded and neglected. By acknowledging these issues, then cutting fares, making buses speedier, and hopefully one day free, it will not only put money back in people's pockets, but restore their faith in local government too.
And finally today, I'm joined by a friend of the show, Mazen Sidahmed, to find out how immigrants are reacting to one of their own now sitting in City Hall. Mazen is the executive director and co-founder of Documented, the independent non-profit newsroom reporting with and for immigrant communities in New York. Well, Mazen, thank you for joining me. Can we start with the reaction from immigrant communities to Mamdani winning the mayoralty?
Mamdani was really elected with a lot of support, I'd say, from immigrant communities. I think that we really focus on three major immigrant communities in New York: the Spanish-speaking immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and Caribbean immigrants. And while there's nuances across all of those different immigrant communities, I think broadly he enjoyed quite widespread support amongst all of them, really due to his focus on affordability. I think a lot of our immigrant communities actually were quite divided in 2024 in the presidential election. We saw a lot of our readers actually come out and support Trump in the 2024 election because they were really focused on the issue of inflation. People felt like the cost of living had really spiraled out of control. And Mamdani's laser focus on that issue had really garnered pretty widespread support in a lot of areas where the Democratic Party had struggled and lost a lot of support. And really the immigrant labor movement in New York City has been growing over the past 10 years. And Mamdani really allied himself with some of the core parts of that movement and was seen as a real advocate and supporter of some of the core issues that the immigrant labor movement was advocating for. So as he came in with pretty broad support and excitement. The general mood in New York has remained quite high. From the election, there was quite a lot of jubilation amongst a lot of our readers. But I'd say that there are kind of two big broad areas that our communities are really focused on: immigration enforcement and immigrant labor. So immigration enforcement has been one of the biggest concerns for immigrant New Yorkers over the past year. We did a story just a few months ago about how immigration enforcement has doubled in New York in 2025. There are hundreds of ICE arrests every week. People are afraid to leave their houses, and it has become just a petrifying time for a lot of immigrant communities, even people's fears of even taking their child to school. So on that front, Mamdani has come out quite forcefully and said that he's really going to try and make New York a city that is safe for immigrant communities. He's created an interagency response team. There has been a real focus on preventing the sharing of any data from the New York City government to the federal government. That's the one area that a local administration can really control. But on a day-to-day level, if you're an immigrant living in New York, the people that reach out to us via WhatsApp, via WeChat, they're still seeing ICE arrests in their communities. It's something that it's very difficult for a local government to do anything on. But rhetorically, the administration has been quite strong. On the labor front, a lot of our readers are delivery workers, they're cab drivers, they work in restaurants, they're home health aides that care for the elderly. Mamdani has been delivering a lot more on that front, and I think people have seen some tangible results. But we've reported on some tensions as well. He's, strangely been quite opposed to legislation that should provide overtime protection for home health aides, people who care for elderly people or sick or mentally unwell people in their homes. Oftentimes those are immigrant workers. Mamdani has strangely been opposed to legislation that would protect their overtime hours. And I think a lot of people in the immigrant labor movement have been shocked by that sort of power play. So there are a few areas where I think some people have been surprised. And as I said, at the local level, sometimes it's hard to feel the tangible results when things are happening from the federal government.
And just tell me on that, Mazen, often when people come into power, the first 100 days, you can get a lot done because you don't get too caught up in what your predecessor had promised. You have a kind of clear vision. The problems, they stand out to you. You can see exactly what you need to negotiate and navigate. Is the feeling that his slowness on some of these issues is him just getting caught up in the machinery of governance, or because actually he's beginning to change his mind on some of the things that he expressed support for when he was not in office?
I think the general perception has been that I don't know if naivete is too strong of a word, but that he's learning city government as he goes. A lot of the people that he's brought in city government have been people who it's their first time working in city government, and they've made some just simple mistakes. I think that, a lot of our Spanish speaking readers were upset that the mayor didn't attend an investiture mass that most mayors attend. A lot of our Spanish readers are Catholic. Those types of things, somebody who has more experience in city government, who is surrounded by people who are in city government, would just know to do. But I think this mayor has really struggled at times to play the game or understand the sort of basics of city government that might make it easier for him to enact his agenda. So I don't think there's any sense that he is wavering or changing his mind on certain things, but I think there is a real sense that they're still learning how to operate in City Hall. And I think another thing is that he doesn't come from City Hall. He was previously in the State Assembly, so he doesn't have those types of relationships as he's now working through a very, very contentious budget battle. He doesn't have the types of relationships that maybe previous mayors might have had, who were more operators at the city level.
If we had a checklist of things that he promised to do or that immigrant communities wanted from their mayor, which are the ones you'd be confident about putting a big tick next to? He wanted to look at stabilisation of rents. He wanted to look at greater child support. He wanted to bring in a supermarket system which would provide more affordable food to people who were often at the lower ends of the wage table. Which ones of those sorts of things would you put a tick against?
I'd say the Universal 2K could be really transformative for low wage New York's, honestly, for people across all different classes and wages. That has received support from Albany, and I think you can pretty confidently put a tick against that happening. There's a pilot that will launch this year in a few communities, specifically communities with a lot of immigrants and low wage workers. That's beginning this year. That's already in action. Will it get to the point where he promised, which is, any babies from 6 months old will have access to free childcare? That I'm not sure of, but you can definitely say there will be some sort of additional support. I think the additional areas that you mentioned, we still require a great deal of support from Albany in New York City. And that relationship, how he navigates that relationship to enact his agenda, will be really the litmus test of how successful he's able to be.
One of the most fascinating things about when we spoke last time was this more complicated relationship with immigrant communities and the president, Mr. Trump. And we always imagine that everybody's on the left. If you're a new migrant, you're fighting for your rights. But actually, many people are quite conservative. As you said, many Hispanic people are very religious, for example. What's been the way that immigrant communities have absorbed his relationship with the president? Because we've seen the two men side by side on several occasions where you get the impression that they kind of have a begrudging respect almost for each other. And I wondered how that played in communities where they're at the same time seeing ICE agents, as you say, wandering around, maybe taking parents on their way to school.
Honestly, complete shock. I think there is the reaction that we've seen from a lot of New Yorkers, and particularly our immigrant New Yorkers. So I think when we were speaking to immigrant communities last year who supported Mamdani, the one caveat and concern around supporting Mamdani is that it will place New York in the crosshairs for a Minneapolis-style escalation. That while everybody was really excited about the prospect of some of the things that Mamdani wanted to deliver on and the fresh energy that he would potentially bring, people were concerned that he would become a foil for Trump and that, New York would become another place that Trump would use to, distract against other things that were happening at the federal level and punish the city for voting for Mamdani. So I think the initial relationship that they've been able to build over these past few months has been a complete shock to people and has somewhat alleviated some of those concerns that New York City was on the brink of a CBP deployment similar to what we saw in Minneapolis. And I think that has relieved a lot of our immigrant communities. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that this is going to be in perpetuity or that this can't change. But I think in the short term, that has been a huge source of relief. Despite the fact that ICE arrests are continuing, ICE is buying up warehouses around New York State with the anticipation of arresting more people and being able to detain more people. So nobody is under the impression that there will be no more ICE arrests. But I think that their relationship has been received in the sense that it might protect New York from being a target.
Well, finally, the tradition of the first 100 days is such an American construct, I believe, from the days of Roosevelt. But what's the hopes for your readers, for the immigrant communities in New York, for the next many more days from 101 on?
I think that immigrant New Yorkers today are living under intense fear. There is a feeling that you can't leave your house at times, that businesses in immigrant neighborhoods, we've done a number of stories about immigrant neighborhoods who are economically really struggling because they just can't get any foot traffic. People don't want to go out and walk around the neighborhood and frequent the businesses that they have previously. So I think over the next few years, folks are really looking to Mamdani to find ways to protect the city, really re-energize the city, and create safer environments for people to go to work and have access to support and services that they need. And I think it's going to be really difficult for Mamdani to deliver on, as we've seen the local government has very little control over federal immigration enforcement. So how they address that challenge is going to be really telling, and whether or not immigrant New Yorkers will start to blame Mamdani and turn on him for the actions of the Trump administration will really be interesting to watch over these next few years.
Mazen Sid Ahmed from Documented. Thank you so much. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can follow us for new editions of the show every week, and you can subscribe to Monocle magazine for reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism too. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced and edited by David Stevens. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, city lovers.